For a classical composer like me, it's good sometimes to step outside of my normal habitat and check what's going on in other genres, and I particularly like checking out pop music production. The technology for music production has improved so much over the last 20 years in particular that if you haven't kept up with it, it can be pretty mind-blowing. We're used to thinking of the idea of digitally manipulated photographs using software like Photoshop, but I don't think it's as widely known just how easy sound can be manipulated today, including individual notes within pre-recorded audio tracks. So I'm going to give you a little guided tour of how all this works from an outsider's perspective. Classical composers sometimes get called out for micromanaging performers by adding too much detail into a score. Older scores by composers like J.S. Bach will often have not much more than just the notes themselves, very little in the way of dynamics or articulation. But gradually the control freaks took over, and today's composers tend to feel that a note is naked if it isn't plastered with all manner of instructions. But try as they will, the control they have is still nothing compared to the control a modern producer has. Using digital audio workstations like Logic Pro or Ableton Live, producers can zoom in to the micro level, controlling the tuning and the precise rhythmic placement of individual notes. But they also have a lot of information about the overall sound picture in ways that I find completely fascinating. The key chart at this level is the frequency spectrum, which represents the range of human hearing from 20 Hz at the low end all the way through to 20,000 at the top, divided into lows, mids and highs. The lows are divided into sub-bass and bass, the mids into low mids, mids and high mids, and the highs into what's called presence and brilliance. For a reference, the piano keyboard goes from around 27 Hz at the low A through to around 4000, with middle C being around 262 Hz. What feels particularly strange to me about this way of thinking is that I usually only consciously think about the bottom two categories. If I write for a cymbal, I usually just think that's a cymbal. I don't necessarily think of it as something that has pitch information that's higher than the piano. Whereas a producer like Ian Kirkpatrick, who's done a lot of Dua Lipa and Selena Gomez's tracks, will think about the precise ranges of the audio spectrum that the cymbal might fill, and how he might manipulate it further.
Think of it like this. How nice is it when you listen to a song fresh, say for instance, someone gives you a hi-hat, you're like, that's high end. But unbeknownst to you, they've darkened that hi-hat a lot. So then when the chorus hits, there's another hat or something that lets in, like, maybe that hi-hat was like kind of up in, 10K. All of a sudden now you're getting stuff in like 15 and it's like, oh my God, the song just got so much brighter. It's like, think of it like not frequentially blowing your load too early.
At the other end of the spectrum, there's a similar issue with percussion. If you think of a bass drum as just a whack and a rhythm, you risk forgetting that it contains actual bass pitch information, which can easily clash with the real bass line. But being aware of these kind of clashes over the entire audio spectrum is second nature for a producer. There's been an interesting debate recently about the frequency range a bit higher up the spectrum in the 100 to 250 Hz range, an octave or so below middle C. The producer Ahi here goes through a bunch of tracks by Skrillex and others, who all seem to deliberately reduce this range in their tracks.
So we can see here the sub bass dips down, comes back up.
So that's a really interesting thought for an acoustic composer like me. Would an orchestration sound cleaner if you reduce the amount going on in this range? Well, this is a little clip of one of the best orchestrators, Ravel, and there seems to be plenty going on in that range, so I guess the jury's still out on this one. The other way producers pay attention to frequency is more familiar to acoustic composers, the idea of not covering a main line too much by putting something else in the same range. So here's Ian again looking over a track he'd produced for Selena Gomez, and he finds a nice synth line which had been removed from the final mix, and he wonders what happened to it.
Oh, let's see what didn't make it. What's this thing? I wonder why I took that out. Probably because it's lame. Let me see what it did with the vocal. Of course she was with the vocal. That's why I took it out.
So even though that synth line was a bit higher up, Ian could sense that it covered the upper harmonics of the vocal too much and made for a messy texture.
Good job, Ian. Thanks, Ian.
Maintaining space like that in the audio spectrum to allow the vocals to shine through is a top priority for pop producers, and it's a trend that was arguably incremented by the demands of rap artists who wanted their fast-moving lyrics to cut through. Noah Shebib, who has produced most of Drake's tracks for the past 10 years, was a pioneer of dampening down the other elements of the production, often creating a muted, almost underwater sound.
I'm just so far gone. October zone, please leave me alone.
And as Estelle Caswell from Vox's Earworm noticed, this sound that she calls a wobbly, drunk underwater effect has become one of the defining sounds of recent years.
Everything sounds like it was recorded 15 feet in a swimming pool, and it's very low and deep and wobbly and muddy, and it's literally on every pop song right now.
Related to that are a bunch of plugins which imitate the sound of earlier analog equipment, vinyl, cassette tapes, buzzy amplifiers, which can add all sorts of wobbles, clicks and distortions to an otherwise pristine track. But to me these kind of tricks are most effective when they're used to really connect and resonate with the meaning of the song. Billie Eilish's brother FINNEAS produces most of her music, and the track Everything I Wanted takes these underwater effects and fills them with more significance. It's no longer just an effect, it's now a depiction of a macabre dream of death and drowning. At one point you can literally hear the voice sound like it's going underwater.
When my head was underwater.
FINNEAS also uses an array of samples to underscore a song's theme. One of the samples he's talked about most often is the Australian sidewalk crossing sound, which he turned into a hi-hat in the track Bad Guy. But more often he'll pick something more meaningful, often integrating it into the main beat of the track.
This is me just lighting a bunch of matches in a bathroom. It became the snare, essentially, for this song of Billie's called Watch. The hook is like, I'll sit and watch your car burn. And so there are all these references to like starting a fire. And so I was like, well, let me try like starting some matches and whatever. And that's like a more inventive way to use a sound than to just be like, yeah, we're gonna start with like sound of the waves rolling in or something.
The song Bury a Friend uses an array of horror film sound effects like the dentist's drill and distorted voices.
I wanna end me.
But more subtly, the harsh jolt of a digitally chopped alarm clock bell. Although you might not think of that as a horror sound, it does subtly match the song lyric, which is apparently written from the point of view of a monster under your bed. If you wanted to sound pretentious, you could say that FINNEAS is taking a leaf out of the Russian film director Sergei Eisenstein's book. Eisenstein's theory was that if you're going to depict a struggle, it wasn't enough just to film a barricade and film the action realistically. You needed to frame the scene with violent lines and cutting angles so that it gave off a sense of struggle before the action even began. So if you want to make a macabre song, build it out of macabre sounds so that we come to it already primed. You could say that Ian Kirkpatrick is also underscoring the party atmosphere of his tracks by literally and very creatively using a party crowd sample as a hi-hat.
There's this sound, but I put LFO tool on that and just let it like go tick, 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 and it sounded like this. And that is so hard with the drums. That is just so fun.
It's fascinating to watch a producer like Ian playing with sound like some kind of flexible Lego that you can build walls with but also stretch into any shape you want. Programs like Melodyne now offer incredible power to manipulate actual recorded sound so that you can even change individual notes within a chord. So here's Ian again. He's found a sample, but he decides he doesn't like one of the notes in the chord, so he slides it up to something he does.
Supposed to be there.
And then he thinks, well, why not create a whole new melody line? And he does that by extending one of the existing notes. A new melody that no one's ever actually played emerges. And then once he's got his samples, he's often very creative in how he pieces them together. In this next clip, he's building a whole string of short samples into a melody, a technique we classical types know from Schoenberg called Klangfarben melody.
Please.
Little pieces of like jazz stretched vocal. Which I chopped up on the bridge. You can make it a phrase that becomes something that you can sing to yourself, you know, when you're walking around the kitchen like, it's fun to try to make those longer phrases out of little pieces of, you know, a gajillion things. Super fun.
But what I find most inspiring is Ian's incredible attention to detail. Watch the tiny adjustments he makes to the vocal in this clip from Dua Lipa's Don't Start Now.
Let's see what that sounded like before.
Don't come out, don't come out,
So like that don't, I f***ed it up and I chopped it to this
don't come out, don't come,
as opposed to,
don't come out,
I love that and it stops before the snare. So it's like you hear it stop. You don't just, I didn't just clip it at the snare. No. So it's like a little, oh, what the f, you know? That kind of